Ears ring, windows rattle, the dog hides under the bed. You've heard it before, thunder from an arc of electric discharge, or from a passing supersonic jet. One doesn't hear jets much anymore, but in the good old days I used to, when F-100 afterburners lit over the desert. Booms from 20 miles away. When you rub feet on the carpet and touch a doorknob, you get a spark and hear a snap. That's the same thing on a tiny scale. Think about the power it takes to make a boom that travels miles with the energy to rattle windows. If you're really close in the mountains on some high windswept ridge, lightning is terrifying. Lightning shock wave will blow trees and rocks apart like dynamite. On rocky peaks, especially granite boulders, you can find the scars. If you know what you're looking for, they're easy to spot. But if not, a magnetometer betrays their signature. Where I live, I find rocks the size of buildings split apart, chunks the size of houses tossed away. It's quite obvious past lightning was more powerful than we see today. It's the explosive blast, the arc blast, the sonic wave that blasts outwards in all directions at the speed of sound like a wall of heavy air. It does not move the air with it, but rolls through it just the way an ocean swell rolls through the ocean. It compresses and decompresses the air it moves through, instantly raising its temperature and pressure, then dropping it in the next instant. There's another effect in the shock wave called ionization. It's the inevitable result of higher temperature and pressure, because to put it in conventional terms, it means more atoms colliding, knocking electrons free. But it's really more than that. A shock wave generates current. The condensate in a cloud is an electric conductor. The dipolar molecule of water aligns with electric fields. Dipoles attract and drops form. Charge moves when this happens, meaning current. Current in a cloud is called bound current. If you don't believe me, question this. Why do governments use electricity to modify weather? And how could they, unless there is something in the cloud to carry current? Watch this Fox 13 show from Tampa Bay, which discusses how Dubai uses electricity to make rain. In other words, a shock wave is a plasma. It may be a weak plasma, like the sonic wave produced by a fighter jet that condenses water vapor, or it may be a sheet of electric current that spits lightning of its own, like the shock wave of a hydrogen bomb. If you are fortunate enough to see a rocket launch or a re-entry, you may witness shock waves that are sufficiently ionized to glow in the upper atmosphere. For perspective, realize there are no shining ions traveling with the shock wave bubble. The bubble is moving through the air, ionizing and exciting atoms as it goes, generating a current in the shock wave. Shock waves are electric. The sight of glowing shock waves in the black of space is surreal. It gives you an idea of what the ancients saw in the sky. Meteors also generate shock waves. The Chelyabinsk event produced a shock wave that injured many people. The Tunguska blast reportedly knocked people off their feet several miles away. Now imagine a world in chaos, where winds shrieked at supersonic speeds. One need not ascribe to Velikovsky to imagine such a thing, because every mainstream theory of impact and accretion, or whatever is in favor today, would necessitate periods of chaotic atmosphere. Supersonic winds would have happened at times, regardless of what science-based creation theory you ascribe to. Any big meteor impact would do it. Even the creationists' 7 days must have entailed some wind. Besides that, we have planets in our solar system with supersonic winds right now. Jupiter is one. To assume supersonic winds and shock waves occurred and should therefore have left their mark on Earth is perfectly sound logic in any cosmology. Yet you don't hear shock waves mentioned much by geologists. They make theories and wave their hands about tectonic forces without finding what does the pushing, but they don't say much about sonic shock waves. They use sonic waves as a tool, and they recognize microfractures in quartz and shock cones in rocks due to meteor impacts, but virtually nothing about the winds that will result, or the effect of the sonic waves. Previous articles have shown that shock waves produced by supersonic winds left tetrahedral-shaped mountains with flat triangular-faced mountain flanks. The evidence shows that Earth was embroiled at times in a maelstrom of winds that actually shaped the surface of the planet. The primary mechanism for triangles you see so ubiquitously in mountains is a region of the shock wave called the separation bubble. When a supersonic wind shears across a surface and meets an obstruction, it lifts to right over the obstruction like a wing, because a high-pressure zone forms in front of the obstruction. This high-pressure zone is called the separation bubble because it separates the supersonic flow from the ground, forcing it to change direction. Wind flow in the following diagrams is left to right unless it's shown otherwise. It's called a bubble because in ideal conditions it forms an actual tetrahedron-shaped bubble of high pressure, low-velocity air surrounded by low-pressure, high-velocity air. The bubble walls, or membrane, is made of shearing and reflected shock waves. They are a predictable, inevitable, measurable boundary layer effect caused by the drag of supersonic wind over a surface. If you've read my past articles on this subject, you'll note I call the separation bubble a low-pressure, low-velocity zone. That was a mistake, so this is meant to correct the record and give some more detail on them because they are the most tangible, accessible, reproducible, and compelling evidence for Velikovsky's theories in existence. I don't say that lightly, but it's true. Shockwave tetrahedrons are more abundant than rock art that can be compared to plasma instabilities. Comparisons of petroglyphs to simulated instabilities are simply shrugged off as pareidolia anyway. They also don't depend on interpretation of tiny points of light from a zillion miles away, or guessing about the nuclear process inside stars or atoms. They don't depend on reinterpreting mythology, equations, or the validity of anyone's physics. Shockwaves are well known by classical physics and applied science. Shockwave tetrahedrons cover our planet. In fact, some aspects of plasma instabilities and astronomical Z-pinch nebula are due to shockwaves. Some petroglyphs depict atmospheric shockwaves too. Sonic shock is essential science in the electric universe, and I'm confident Hans Alvin would agree. In a plasma, shock waves and currents are coherent. Shock waves generated during past cosmic upheaval on Earth interacted with solid ground in whatever matter they touched. They echoed from solid surfaces in shear zones. They vibrated and wobbled and crawled across the Earth, making piles of debris we call mountains. They interacted in patterns of constructive and destructive interference and resonated in harmonic frequencies. They left those patterns in the mountains for us to see. Shock waves are, after all, plasma sound waves. They are tangible, falsifiable, and accessible. They can be reproduced. I've been noodling how to make a solid tetrahedron in a wind tunnel. The problem is getting adherence. If dry powders or sands are used, they won't stick. If wet anything is used, it'll make a mess. Nature doesn't care about messes and splatters stuff everywhere. But a wind tunnel is an expensive piece of equipment that doesn't stand well to supersonic sandblasting. A magnetic dust and magnet won't work to adhere a tetrahedron because the dust would take the shape of the magnet. I can't get an ionized supersonic wind generator without a Chinese electric turbine, and so far the Chinese aren't answering my calls. Neither is NASA. Funny, it's the same phone number. I think maybe a big drop of glue or epoxy could be used as the obstruction in a wind tunnel if it were performed while tacky. It should mold to the shockwave separation bubble without flying away. Anyway, it's not an easy problem. But wait, nature provides proof. We don't need a wind tunnel. The atmosphere itself is our laboratory. Iron meteors enter Earth's atmosphere at supersonic speeds. Friction with the atmosphere melts and ablates the iron. Ablation patterns provide the proof of shockwave tetrahedrons. Look at Figure 10 and the several other images to follow, which show molded iron shock tetrahedrons at the tips of flow patterns made by separation bubbles. This is tangible proof made in conditions similar to theory. This piece of data is a start to prove science as we know it is mostly wrong. Well, okay, hugely wrong, massively wrong. These meteorites should be prima facie evidence of electric Earth theory. This is a meteor of iron with an ablated phase caused by its supersonic entry into the atmosphere. Heat pressure and supersonic shock waves molded this phase. The supersonic wind impacting the meteor head-on segregated into bubble-like pressure regimes. Low pressure zones where wind velocity was greatest created scoops and divots. High pressure zones segregated these airflows, leaving sharp dividing ridges and triangular separation bubbles where the airflow separated from the meteor. The smooth divots are impressions of flow streams, and the triangles appear at their tips. The change in direction as airflow separated from the object created separation bubbles, which molded the fluid iron. Molten iron was pushed from the divot like pudding and held in the high-pressure separation bubble, molding it to form in the form of the bubble. Look closely and you'll find where some tips broke off. The entire divot is, in effect, the separation bubble. It is literally bubbles formed with skin effect from shock waves that hold tension like a bubble's film. It creates Y-shaped structures around a triple point where shock waves and bubbles meet, sometimes called the lambda structure. In the case of mountain building, winds laden with dust passed into the bubble and were heated, compressed, and slowed to a stop, passing through the shock wave. The ground was statically charged and adhered the dust, mud, sand, stuff falling from outer space, or whatever the wind carried. Hence the dust piled in the shape of a bubble, a tetrahedron. Take a look at the similarity in these tetrahedrons formed by a hot blast of air in South America to the ones along the edge of the meteorites. Really, it can't be more obvious. It's visually apparent how a non-rotating, downburst wind layered the dust in a consistent pattern of tetrahedrons formed by separation bubbles where the wind impacted and deflected from the land. This was made by a blowtorch aimed at the ground, the hot exhaust of a mesocyclone that churned in a plasma storm of Jovian proportions. The side of the tetrahedron facing the wind will be a perfect isosceles triangle if the wind strikes normal to the object. If the wind hits obliquely, is interfered with by adjacent shock waves, is subsonic or transient in its velocity, or if the dust load deposited doesn't fill the entire separation bubble, it will deform the tetrahedron. You are not suffering from pareidolia. A triangle is a triangle, and that is what you're seeing. We could be scientific and take measurements, prove these are triangles, but I think we can use common sense. Here are more examples of tetrahedrons formed on iron meteorites. The size of the separation bubble depends on the size of the object, because that determines the area of wind moving past the object, and therefore the size of the shock wave. So the bigger the meteor, the bigger the tetrahedrons. The constituency of the rock also affects the roughness of the surface, whether it's chunky or smooth, as they say. Regardless of many variables, the triangular face of separation bubbles are distinct and appear exactly where they should if one traces the wind patterns. Gee, somebody out there must have noticed this before. I'll bet there's some obscure mustachioed PhD at the Upper Siberian Institute of Aerodynamic Widgets who knows all about this. Please call me. In a completely different circumstance, lightning-generated shock waves also produce tetrahedrons. The next four figures are photos of an iron-bearing rock that has been struck by lightning, partly melted and vitrified, with raised triangular layers where fluid metal was trapped by separation bubbles. The lightning left a yellowed, chemically altered trail where its surface conducted to a shoe-shaped pool where the rock melted. The arc lightly met some discontinuity or crack in the rock where it burrowed in, creating a hot spot. Cutting beneath the skin of the rock created an arc flash that trapped triangular sheets of molten rock in the separation bubbles, pointing outward from the center of the blast, shown in the following images. The final image shows a track of very small triangles marching out of the molten puddle. The amplitude of the triangle is related to the cross-section of the wind that created it. What this little trail of arrowheads means is that a very narrow supersonic jet stream blasted from the lightning bolt and made this channel in the rock, and you can see exactly the path it took. Can you find any other tetrahedrons surrounding the track outlined? They are aimed perpendicular to the narrow track and larger amplitude. I counted 6 good-sized ones, but there are a bunch of small ones too. The arc channeled a narrow focused jet, while at the same time, shock waves blasted outwards in a diffuse wave that produced larger amplitudes. There is also a second lightning track from the bottom right corner. There are shock patterns that correlate with the blast from each lightning track. For global scale winds, separation bubbles become quite large. Figure 17 gives you some idea of scale. The separation bubble that creates a mountain is just the very foot of a shock wave structure, much more complex than a simple tetrahedron. There are flow paths in, around, and behind the separation bubble that all leave their mark on the ground. If the wind keeps blowing dust at supersonic speed, the tetrahedron formed in the separation bubble blocks the air, forming a new obstruction to the wind, and a new separation bubble forms in front of it, trapping more dust that layers in the triangular shape of its windward face. This blankets the tetrahedron face with layer after layer of deposit with each pulse of the wind. Each pulse of the wind may carry different constituents of dust and charge, so each layer deposited has its own characteristic chemistry. It is exactly the same way wind makes sand dunes, except supersonic shock waves are rigid and straight and make sharp angles instead of soft curves. Sand dunes are formed in the high-pressure, low-speed zones beneath an undulating wind, and the troughs are low-pressure, high-speed zones. The high-speed winds carry the sand to the low-speed zones, and that's why they appear in waves. Static electricity plays a role in sand dunes too, lofting and adhering the sand, and so it does with shock waves. Each layer's chemistry reacted with adjacent layers. The matter laid down still swam with free charge. Migrations and recombinations focused at the layer interfaces, still hissing and vibrating with shock wave echoes, where dissimilar matter made reactions, drawing ions from the surroundings. Charge built an electric field across these interfaces, in the way a capacitor makes an electric field. Seams became hardened and mineralized, and sometimes evacuated by gases evolved from reactions that channeled caverns as they expanded. The electric field, transverse to the seam, is why most quartz veins grow transverse across rock seams. They are the electrical expressions left by shock waves and electric fields. The consensus theory of hydrolyzed silica migrating into rock seams by hydrothermal action isn't entirely wrong, but it misses the role of electricity and how it would accelerate the pace of crystal formation. It also misses the role electricity plays in the migration of conductive metals into quartz veins and a number of other things. Shock waves took different polarities. They generated lightning, they connected ground to cloud in a sheet of plasma current, they ionized air, water vapor, and dust, they melted metals, they vibrated and electrified the ground, they segregated airborne matter with electrostatic filtration. They compressed matter in geometric shapes and charged it with current to fuse it together. They formed plasma networks of active circuitry. They patterned the wind in diamonds that glowed, with sparks shooting through. They turned biological beings to jelly. Shock waves are a pathway for discharge, a current generator, and a capacitor across the walls of shock membranes. They are a big piece of Earth's circuitry and a principal action of nature. They are the most obvious, prolific, and easily defined proof that Earth was formed and still performs as an electrical body. And they are one of the most beautiful. After all, they produce these mountains. I want to give special thanks to Stefan Amala, who took the photos of the rocks in Finland. Stefan discovered thunderbolts recently, and like most of us, arrived here because he knew the rest of the world was crazy. Stefan is very enthusiastic and immediately recognized these rocks for what they are and contacted us. Wouldn't you know, I was writing an article on tetrahedrons when his photos arrived. Well, that is how things resonate in the electric universe, isn't it? We are all the same ether. It is what is. We can either resonate in harmony or make destructive interference. That's our free will.